Bloom's taxonomy. Well, you may have heard of this before, and we really have a couple different reasons why we're talking about this. The first thing is that we really want to figure out the different types of goals we have for our students. Sometimes we just want them to memorize things. Sometimes we want to integrate their knowledge that they already have with new knowledge. And sometimes we want them to be able to use it in a real world setting, and sometimes we want them to do things that are even more complicated. And what we're going to go through in this video is really the idea that when you have different goals, you need to teach them differently. There are different instructional methods that align with different levels of cognition or different types of thinking. Those also need to be assessed differently. And we're also going to talk about the problems that occur when you assess at the wrong level of cognition. And this is something that happens a lot, where you have a lot of really easy, lower level cognitive processes that don't really tell you whether or not your students have met the goals that you have, or you have things that are a little too difficult that also don't tell you whether or not your students have met your goals. So in a very broad sense, Bloom's taxonomy has 6 different levels, and it's really just a way to say that, when you're thinking about things or trying to navigate the world, you use different cognitive processes. At the most simple and the most basic, you have the recall level. Above that, you have comprehension, meaning that I have knowledge that's integrated. Then there's application, analysis, evaluation, and synthesis or creation. Now, as we go up this ladder, things get more and more complex, and every higher level requires the ability or some ability at the lower levels. So if I am doing some comprehension stuff, I have to recall some things in order to actually understand something about it. If I want to use something, I really need to understand what I'm doing in order to actually apply my knowledge. And if I want to analyze, I actually need a variety of different strategies, and I need to understand kind of what we're going to call the deep structure of the problem. So we're going to go through each one of these things. Things I want you to know. 1, the order. Recall is the simplest. Creation or synthesis is the most complicated. Second thing, I want you to know that higher levels are dependent on lower levels. Make sure that you keep that in mind. So when we talk about the lowest level, we're talking about recall. And recall is just about basic memorization. And you have a stimulus response chain where I have a term and you connect it to a definition. I have 2 + 2, you have 4 on the other side. I have the word ally, you have a friend who will help you in a fight. That's the definition of it. Now, all this being said, there's really no guarantee at the recall level that I actually understand anything. There is a lot of language that we use that we don't really understand, and if we're pressed to define words, we really can't do it. One that I was just doing with my students a couple weeks ago was the word disguise. And we looked at the word disguise and we tried to define it, but then we said, well, let's break it down into its root and its prefix. And so the dis and the guise. And the dis, people, had a pretty easy time defining, but guise, Guise, that really threw them for a loop. And it was really hard to define. And there are a lot of words that we use like that every day that we really don't understand, but we can use them because we just kind of remember when and why we're using them. And in other ways, I remember when I was in a statistics class once, I had to remember, the normal distribution. And I could define it. I could define some probability things about it, but I had no idea what I was talking about. I didn't know what a distribution was. And it probably took me till midway through my second stats class to actually figure that out. And so when we're trying to memorize things or recall things, we're just trying to make sure that we are rewiring our brain in a way that when I get a certain stimulus, I'm going to get a certain response. And so if I have a term, I want to get that definition. If I have a state, I want to get the capital. If I, say scientific principle, I want a description of that scientific principle, a memorized version. And the way that we build this is just through repetition. So if I'm teaching at the recall level, and that's my goal, I just need to get my students to rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. I can throw in a few different mnemonic devices, like when you do the musical scales, good boys do fine always, and things like that. Or PEMDAS for order of operations, if you're talking about math. Those are all kind of memory aids to compact it, and you're going to read about working memory later on when we talk about cognition in another video. And we're trying to reduce the load on working memory. Now, if I want to test recall, I need to show my students something they have already seen in the exact way that they have seen it. So if I have terms and definitions that I want them to match, I need to have them written exactly how we talked about them in the book, how they were defined in the notes, or whatever. If I change anything, I start moving into comprehension. And the line between all these different levels is rather fuzzy. And so we're going to try to keep things pretty clearly. But the key thing is, if I just want students to memorize things like, Madison is the capital of Wisconsin, I just need them to rehearse it. And when I ask them the question, I can't say, what's the capital of the Badger State? Because they may not know that I'm referring to Wisconsin. All the states have their nicknames and so on. When we think about having students give a free response, they don't need to say it exactly how it was stated, in some cases, if I'm talking about a definition, but they need to write Madison or something really close. When we talk about spelling and penmanship and things like that, well, then that there are some fuzzy areas there too. But this is the most basic level of cognition. When we get up to the next level, comprehension, the key ideas is that instead of having just one knowledge bit term with another definition, now I have each one of these things connected to other ideas. So for my term, I may have synonyms. For my definition, I may have other descriptions, and all these other things are connected together, and this network can get bigger and bigger. And the bigger it is, the better it is, because what I'm trying to do is build multiple pathways to existing knowledge in the brain. Great thing about knowledge, once it's in your brain, it's pretty much there forever. The trick is usually just trying to get it out. And sometimes when we have a recall-like thing, it is very, what we'll say is cue dependent. I need the right word or the right term or the right situation to cause that memory to come up. When I have a bigger network of knowledge that's linked together, I can access this network through any one of these pathways, and then everything lights up in my brain. Now, if I'm going to teach at this level, I need to think about having students elaborate, and basically they're trying to connect what we're talking about now to other things that they understand, and then it's my job to tell them whether they're right or wrong. Another way that I can do it, I can bring up new examples, and we can compare good examples and bad examples to try to build the concept. And this is something that's almost always true when you're trying to, talk about a concept or understand causes of events or things like that. We look at good examples and we look at bad examples, and we think about what makes the good example a good example and what makes a bad example a bad example. And I try to figure out, what are the common mistakes that students are going to make? And I make sure that I give them examples that kind of draw out those issues. I can also paraphrase or reword things or have them put it in their own words and so on. And these are all ways that I can teach it. But during teaching, I need to have that feedback loop where I can tell them whether they're on point or if they're a little bit off the mark. To assess comprehension, I have 3 basic strategies. One, I can paraphrase a question to see if they understand the meaning, but what if I word it in a way that they never heard of? In other words, if I use the Badger State. If you've never heard of that, the question makes no sense. And you may know that Madison is the state capital of Wisconsin. You just don't know that Wisconsin is the Badger State. And so really, I'm not testing you on your knowledge of the capital, but I'm also testing you, I am testing you on that, but I'm also testing you on whether or not you know that Wisconsin is referred to as the Badger State. So there's a whole bunch of ways that this can go wrong. And most assessments are at the recall level. And one of the reasons is because it's the easiest. Once we get up into higher levels, things can go wrong, and they can go wrong badly. If I'm going to have them paraphrase it so they can put it in their own words and redescribe it. But, there are a couple things that we'll talk about. One, it's not as efficient, but it does give me better quality. And I have to make a bunch of judgments about whether or not they really get it. And this is not always easy to do. The bigger issue, though, is that students will often use your words or their friends' words or the text's words or something they've seen before, and that's not really putting it in their own words. And so it requires you to, one, teach them what that means. Two, keep track of all the different examples and descriptions you use during class, because really those become recall level responses. And three, think carefully about how much time it's going to cost you in order to get this better quality information. The third way is to test relationships between ideas. And so if you think of like the SAT, they have, A is to B as C is to what, and then I'm trying to come up with parallel ideas. Of course, that does require that they understand every one of those bits. And I'm not really testing them on those things, and that the relationship between A and B is the relationship between C and D or C and E or whatever. I can talk about things that are similar. I can talk about things that are different. When I'm comparing and contrasting, I can ask them to explain why something isn't correct or what mistake was made or something like that. So I have a lot of options, but these are my three primary strategies. If we get to the application level, now I'm really making sure that they not only can recall it, they understand it, but they can also use it. And so the key thing here is I will tell them to use some particular skill. So, if we're thinking about math, or we're thinking about science and scientific method, or I'm having in mathematics solve a word problem, I want them to be able to use some algorithms or some processes that we've already talked about in class. What I want them to be able to do is when I direct them to say, use your knowledge to figure out how these things fit together or what the relationship is. And the key thing is that they have not seen the specific example I'm showing them before. So if we've talked about doing division problems with remainders, I've shown them several. Now I'm giving them a new one. That's an application task. If I'm using word problems, again, I've described different situations, but I'm telling them, find the remainder, find the quotient, things like that, and they're just using it. If I want them to use the distributive property, I tell them to use the distributive property. If we're in social studies and I want them to use, some kind of principle about, say, I'm teaching them about the concept of free speech and what type of speech is protected and not, I teach them those concepts and then I give them new examples for them to interpret. If I'm using language arts and I'm talking about tenses, or the proper form of to, T-O, T-O-O, or T-W-O. I'll give them new examples that we haven't talked about. The difference between I and me when I'm doing self-referential sentences. Same thing. We talk about the principle, but then I give them a new situation. The key thing here is that when I'm teaching this, I need a lot of practice because the real world is complicated and there are typically an infinite number of ways that you can, or situations in which you will need to apply this knowledge. And I want to expose you to enough of them that you kind of get the underlying principle down pat. To assess at this level, I need to do the same thing. I need to make sure that I'm giving you a new situation, but it's similar enough to ones that you've seen before. But it's up to you to remember what you're supposed to do and do it. And that's the key thing about application. That process of what they need to do needs to be in there. I can't have a checklist. I can't have a step-by-step process. That needs to be internalized for this application task to really assess at the application level. Now, before we get into the higher levels of thought, we'll talk about, well, what happens if you assess at the wrong level? Oftentimes, when I talk to teachers or students who are in student teaching, they'll say, we went through this exercise and then everybody couldn't do it, or what's happening in the classroom, they seem to be getting it, but when it comes time to do a standardized test, there is a big mismatch between what I see them doing in class and what they do on the test. And typically what's going on is that things are operating at a different level of cognition. So if you assess at the correct level of cognition, when students succeed, you can be confident that they met your goals. If they fail, you can be confident that they didn't meet your goals. But when things get out of alignment, it's not easy to see what's really going on. So if you assess at a level higher than you intended, students may fail, but it doesn't mean they haven't met your goal. And we use a weightlifting analogy throughout these to try to make it easier to understand. And so if I want them to lift 50 pounds, but during the test I had them lift 75 or 100, well, just because you can't lift the higher weight doesn't mean you couldn't lift the weight I wanted or was training you to lift. Right? So if you can't do it, it doesn't mean that you haven't met my goal. However, if you can do it, well, then obviously you can lift 50 pounds. So if I have a comprehension goal, but I give you an application task and you succeed, I can be confident that you comprehend it. Likewise, if it's an analysis task and I have a comprehension goal, I can feel confident that you comprehend it. If I assess at a level of cognition lower, here I have grades and responses that show more success than there should be. Suppose again the goal is that I want them to lift 50 pounds, but I only ask them to lift 25 during the strength assessment. Well, if you haven't lifted, or if you lift 25, it doesn't mean you can lift 50. But if you can't lift 25, it doesn't mean that you can't lift 50 either. And so if you succeed, I can't be confident that you met my goal. And if you fail, I do know that you haven't met the goal. And these things happen all the time in classrooms when there's a slight misalignment between what you teach in class and what you spend all your time on, what you think they need, and then what the assessments are. And the biggest drawback for this is assessments that are at a lower level that are in the textbook than what you are really going for in your lesson. And we'll talk about this when we talk about setting goals and objectives and what we want all that to look like. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So right now, these are the main things that we're talking about. Different levels of cognition, what they are, basic description of the first three, and remembering that each higher level requires the lower level. Recall is a simple stimulus response chain, very limited. Comprehension is a network of knowledge, a bunch of different pieces connected together. And the application is actually using it in a real world situation. When I assess at the wrong level of cognition, problems occur. Next video is going to talk about higher level cognition and what those three levels are all about.